This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, we continue our investigation into the murder of Laci Peterson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, with my inspiring co-host, Alice.
Thanks, Brett. Man, I had just been complaining to you, so you made me change my mood.
Well, you inspire me to complain, so it works out.
That's not good. Well,
I'm just kidding, Alice.
I'm working in my last bits of the holiday season. I baked another batch of pumpkin chocolate chip cookies just to get it all in.
Wow.
I just thought you should know that.
Chocolate chip cookies.
Oh, they are good.
That sounds amazing.
I'm not going to pat myself
I wish I was going to work tomorrow.
I know.
I'd make you bring some to me.
Sorry.
Maybe I should go into work. Are you going into work tomorrow?
I think so. Yeah.
Huh. Are you bringing cookies?
Yeah, you're going to come?
I may have to swing by. Yes, Alice and I, as we are recording, it is almost the new year. You guys, by the time you hear this, we'll be well into 2021, and you'll know whether or not it's better than 2020. Let's cross our fingers. January's not looking great, guys, but, I'm going to hope that it gets better. We're on, the cusp of another roaring 20s when everybody's leaving behind this pandemic, and it's going to be one long celebration and prosperity and happiness and everything else. So let's all hope for that's, this is you got to go through the pain before you see the gain or whatever. I don't know. That's my hope. That's my hope for the new year. My New Year's wish to you guys. But good, bad, or indifferent, you still got our podcast, and we are still talking about the murders of the murders of Laci and Conner Peterson. This is our third episode. The first episode was more background, sort of setting up the story for you. And last episode, we really got into the timeline, particularly as to the day that Laci disappeared. At this point, Scott has left the marina. He has called Laci. We played a voicemail message that he left for Laci and spent some time talking about that last time. So I think the best thing to do is just to jump right back in with the timeline on that day, December 24th, 2002.
Right. So to remind you, that voicemail we last heard was about 2:15 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Now, at about between 3:25 and 4:12 p.m., we know that Scott said he pulled over for gas at a Chevron in Livermore, and he called Laci again. Bank records show this purchase was at 3:25 p.m. Scott makes another call to Laci's cell phone at 3:52 p.m., but this time he doesn't leave a message. And it's a 48-minute drive from the Chevron to his warehouse, according to Yahoo Maps. And if you guys want to check that out for yourselves, you can plug these into Yahoo or Google Maps. The Chevron is located at 2186 Las Positas Court in Livermore, California, and his warehouse is located at 1027 Emerald Street, Modesto. Now, that places Scott getting back to his warehouse at around 4:13 p.m. Now, this next segment, from about 4:13 to 4:23 p.m., we know that Scott arrives back at the warehouse around 4:15 p.m. He says that he unhooked the boat and estimated spending no more than 5 minutes in the office. And he thinks this is when he sees a fax regarding an incoming shipment. Scott tells the police that he remembers seeing the fax because he was disappointed that the shipment was arriving when it was. And Scott says he then headed home. The incoming fax was time-stamped 11:28 Pacific Standard Time. So the fax came sometime after Scott had left for the marina.
I just want to reiterate, this is yet again, Scott, he remembers everything about this fax, but this is like the third time he's forgotten to take the umbrellas out of the back of his car, or his truck. I mean, he's unhooked the boat. Presumably, in doing that, he's looked into the back of the truck and thought, there's those umbrellas that I've been carrying around this whole time that I brought with me specifically to leave them here at the warehouse. But, oh well, I guess I'll just take them back home. But he remembers exactly the fax and everything he thought about the fax. It's just, I don't know. I can't understand why he never takes the umbrellas out the back of his truck.
I got nothing for you.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody does. Okay, so now things get even more interesting. It's around 4:24 when he leaves his the warehouse, and he estimates that he gets back home between 4:30 and 4:45, which would be consistent with the amount of time it takes him to drive from the warehouse. He enters through a side gate and he finds the dog, Mackenzie, with his leash on. Scott removes the leash and puts it on the patio table. Now remember, this is consistent with what the neighbor said, that she found the dog wandering around. She took it back inside the patio, closed the gate, and now Scott is finding the dog in that location.
So one thing I have to note, Brett, I know you have a dog, but so Karen found Mackenzie first. So let's keep in mind that the neighbor said that she found Mackenzie with her leash on at 10:18 a.m. And this is about 6 hours later, almost 7 hours later, that Scott comes back and finds that the leash is still on Mackenzie outside. My initial thought is that the dog's been outside for about 7 hours. Probably, at least he's outside so he can go to the bathroom, but he probably doesn't have food or water out there, maybe some water. But when I leave my dogs that I've had in the past out for that long, they start barking, they start making a ruckus, especially if they're not typically outdoor dogs.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what was going on with Mackenzie that day. I guess, Mackenzie's often presented as an older dog. I don't know how old Mackenzie actually was, but maybe Mackenzie just sort of laid around all day on the patio waiting for somebody to come back. The interesting thing, once again, to me, is Scott shows up and there's the dog with its leash on. And I know there are some people, and people are going to write in and be like, well, I leave my leash on my dog sometimes. Okay, fine. But that's not that normal a thing to do. You don't normally just leave the leash on the dog as it wanders around outside. That's just not something you would typically do. So
right,
you would
because it drags the leash through the mud. It gets it dirty. The dog gets tangled in it. If there's like a metal piece, if they swing their head, it can really hit them and hurt them. It's just an annoyance, right? That even the dog wants off.
Right. And you think Scott, when he saw that, would think that was weird. I mean, I thought, frankly, that the neighbor would think the same thing, but here it's even worse. It's his dog. He would know whether this is an ordinary thing for Mackenzie to be wandering around with his leash on. It certainly strikes me as strange. It doesn't seem as though it struck Scott as strange necessarily. In any event, he enters the home. The dog runs inside. They also apparently had some cats. Cats run in too. Scott sees the mop bucket which he empties. He says he was afraid the cats might drink out of the mop bucket. I'd be more concerned the dog would drink out of the mop bucket, but that's just me. In any event, he pours the water out and puts the bucket and the mops on the front walkway near the door. He grabs the mail. Laci's car is in the driveway, but Laci's not home. He assumes that Sharon had picked up Laci and that she was at her mom's preparing for Christmas Eve dinner.
Hey, Brett, that's an interesting thing, right? I mean, Christmas Eve is a pretty big holiday, and you would think that Laci would have called him to say, hey, by the way, don't wait for me. My mom's picking me up to go prepare for dinner. It just seems like a very big assumption that he wouldn't be surprised or be concerned that Laci never said anything about going over, because likely they were going to drive over together.
A normal person in a normal relationship would be very concerned at this point. You know, this story does not go the way I think it should go. If it were me and I had called my wife multiple times and not heard from her, number one. Number two, she's 8 months pregnant. Number three, I come home and my dog is wandering around outside with his leash on and her car's in the driveway and she's not in the house, I would be really worried. I'd be kind of freaking out at that point. You know, there's no reason for him not to be concerned. You know, this isn't, you remember Amy Bechtel's husband, you know, when he got home from rock climbing, he did not necessarily think that Amy should be there because he knew she was going to go on a long run. But it wasn't very long before he started to get concerned that she was missing. And he turned down some offers to go have pizza and various other things because he wanted to wait for her to get home. He didn't want to freak out about it, but he was getting concerned. Scott, you know, he doesn't seem to have any concern. Even at this point, he's gone inside. She's not there, even though her car's there. He assumes she's with her mom, but like you said, never called him back, never let him know what she was doing. And so he just goes about his business. His clothes are a little wet, presumably from being out in the bay. So he takes them off. He throws them in the washer. While he's doing that, he's, you know, removing some rags that had been in the washer. He's throwing in the soap and everything else. This is something he apparently often did. He'd wash his clothes when he got home because he worked with so many chemicals. This obviously had more to do with him being wet than anything else, or if you think he killed somebody, to take care of any evidence that might have been there. He goes in, he gets the pizza out from the last night, gets himself a glass of milk.
Okay, so wait, I gotta stop you there for a second. We know it's Christmas Eve dinner. I get maybe he hasn't eaten all day, but it is a little strange to me that he's going to eat pizza right before he's supposed to go over to Christmas dinner, Christmas Eve dinner. Thanksgiving, Christmas Eve, any big meal. I usually actually basically fast for the day so I can eat as much as possible. So this strikes me as strange. I get that he was out and he probably didn't eat lunch, but I still find it strange that he's eating cold pizza before a fancy meal.
That's a good point. If you think he did it, then he knows he's not going to be eating dinner anytime soon. So he needs to get some pizza, I guess. I don't know. It's possible. Like you said, he just hadn't eaten anything and he was starving to death. And so he wanted a couple pieces of pizza before he got ready. But the pizza box is on the counter when the police show up later on. And this is the story he tells. So as far as he's concerned, he's eating pizza, big dinner or not. He takes a shower. He gets dressed. He goes back into the kitchen. He listens to some phone messages. He listens to the message that he left Laci when he was leaving the marina.
So I don't know what kind of voicemail system they have here, but if he's listening to a message at the home, I assume it's one of those like box recordings, right? He's not listening to her cell phone. It's like one of those you press play. And back in the day, I remember, I had one. You could tell if a message had not been played before. So I don't know if he had this feature, but if he's listening to the voicemail he left Laci and he could tell that it hadn't been listened to, that is another thing that would make me start to worry.
Yeah, the little red light would be flashing on it if you had messages that you hadn't listened to yet. And apparently that's what's going on here is he called their landline when he called Laci. The first thing that seems to tip Scott off to the fact there might be a problem is he says he listens to a message by Laci's stepfather asking for them to bring whipped cream over, which this, I guess, he thinks is weird because somebody had to pick Laci up. So why is he calling their house? At this point, he calls Laci's parents' home, and this is at about 5:17 p.m. He asks if Laci is there and is told that she is not. At this point, Scott tells Sharon, who's Laci's mom, that her car is still in the driveway and she's not home. And Sharon asks if Mackenzie was in the yard, and Scott, this triggers, I guess, for Scott, the fact that the leash was still on the dog when he found the dog.
So at about 5:18 p.m., this is when the search for Laci began. Over the next half hour, Scott exchanged 2 more calls with Laci's mom and Ron. Scott began knocking on neighbors' doors, calling neighbors and friends, and he heads to the park with Mackenzie. Sharon told Scott they would begin calling hospitals so he could check the park while he checked the park. And Ron called 911 at 5:47 to report Laci as missing. Scott gives his first interview with police that night, and there is video of this in the documentary. You can probably pull it up somewhere and watch it. And over the next few months, a number of things would happen that would become important in the case, and we'll discuss those later. But for the most part, that is the timeline of the day that Laci disappeared.
And it's going to be another 4 months before we get any kind of resolution to what happened to Laci and Conner. But in April 13th, 2003, some people walking near the San Francisco Bay will find the bodies of both Laci and Conner, and Scott will be arrested soon thereafter, charged with their murders, and eventually tried for those murders. That's pretty much the timeline, at least as we're going to discuss it up to this point. There are going to be other things we're going to talk about, as Alice said, but we're going to do that in this sort of, as we walk through the prosecution's evidence and we talk about the things that the prosecution highlighted during their trial. Before we get into that, though, I do think it's worth talking about the sort of elephant in the room when it comes to this case, and that's the sensationalization of murder trials, and this one in particular. If you guys have seen the documentary on the Scott Peterson case, it's as much about the media and the role that the media plays in this case as it is about the facts and the murders and the trial itself. And it's really interesting in the damage, and damage may be too pejorative, but certainly how the media can affect a trial, prevent a fair trial, and maybe prevent justice. What do you think about that, Alice?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this case reached all ends of the world, right? This was not just in Modesto, California. It was on news channels basically 24 hours a day from Christmas Eve on. And your jury pool are usually people who live within the community and they watch TV. They have family members talk. I mean, this was the topic of conversation among friends at the water cooler for months. And so it's hard to have a jury pool that isn't infected when the media has such a far reach, and the media also has a narrative. From the beginning, they were tearing Scott apart well before there was an arrest warrant signed by a judge to arrest him. Now, typically when you have a jury pool that could be tainted, what you do is you move cities, and that's typically enough. You can just move down the road and you get out of the kind of hometown feel that may infect the jury. But here, hometown was the entire world. Everyone, I mean, this was truly on just about every news channel. It was impossible to get away from it. So you could have moved this case to another state. I don't think it would have mattered the amount of coverage that this case got. There was a narrative out there and it was being pushed hard, and it was that Scott was the murderer.
Yeah, you might be able to try it today and find people who've never heard of Scott Peterson, though even that would be difficult. But you certainly couldn't do it at the time. I mean, this was The birth of 24-hour media was really the OJ case. And it's really interesting to look into that and how that was just when 24-hour news coverage was coming into its own, and CNN and all these other stations that are just always on, and they needed content, and all of a sudden OJ happened. And I think a lot of those same people saw in this another opportunity to have something to fill the television that wasn't the Iraq War. I mean, that's basically the only thing that was going on at the time, was the beginning of the Iraq War, which obviously got a lot of coverage, but this was very different. And it was something that you could change things up and you could fill as much time as you wanted. But in doing that, you get a lot of speculation and you get a lot of rumor and a lot of innuendo and a lot of false facts come out. People believed, one of the ones they point to in the documentary so much is that the whole house smelled of bleach when the police showed up. And apparently there's no record of that. Nobody actually ever said that. So nobody knows where that came from. And it's probably just an outgrowth of the fact there were some mops. And so somebody said, oh, the whole house smelled of bleach. And that became part of the story. And if you're a juror and you're walking in and you're trying to stay unbiased and you want to give this man a fair trial, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking about that bleach and you're thinking, well, I'm going to give him a fair trial, but man, the whole place smelled of bleach. There's a reason there's no physical evidence, the bleach, right? And it's difficult to get past this. I'll say this. I think juries try really hard and jurors try really hard to set aside those things. But I don't know that it's impossible. I don't know that it's possible to do it entirely. It's just not human nature to be able to segregate facts in your mind that effectively. But be that as it may, Scott was going to have a trial. And one way or the other, the state was going to put on its case and he was going to put on his defense. And it took jury selection in this case. Took forever for this very reason, because they were attempting as best they could to get a jury that was not biased. And we're going to talk about the jury a good bit in this case. It becomes important as we go along. It's the cornerstone really of some of Scott's appeals in this case. Whether or not that really affected his trial is something we'll get to later. For now, let's go ahead and talk about the trial itself. And we're going to start off very much from the perspective of the prosecution, what the prosecution put on, what the defense said in response. And then at some point, I don't know that we'll get finished with this today, we'll move on to the defense side and talk about some of the defense arguments that the defense made in trial.
Right. So the prosecution's case against Scott is a pretty simple theory. Their general theory is that Scott murdered Laci on December 23rd, and then he dumped her body into the marina the next day. And that's basically it. Now, the problem is there isn't a lot of direct evidence of that taking place, right? We have Scott speaking to the police the night of December 24th, and he has an alibi, and he also has corroborating evidence, right? Remember that time-stamped receipt from when he bought a parking ticket at the marina. He has the voicemail time-stamping his day, his day throughout the day. And there's just not much known about that day except for what Scott says.
And we're going to talk about, as we walk through this, some of the concrete evidence, some of which is actually concrete, that the prosecution had in this case. But, and maybe this is something to talk about at the very beginning. We've talked about this in other episodes, but for those of you who haven't listened religiously to all our episodes, this is not a direct evidence case. There are no witnesses who saw, Scott dumping a body into the bay or murdering Laci. And the circumstantial evidence that we have here is of really the traditional variety of circumstantial evidence. So DNA, blood, fingerprints, those are all circumstantial evidence. Those are pieces of circumstantial evidence. Usually all circumstantial evidence is evidence from which you have to draw an inference. So if you see someone shoot someone, you don't have to draw an inference from that. You just saw them shoot them, right? So that's direct evidence. If you get up and testify about that, that's direct evidence. if someone's fingerprint is at the scene, the inference you draw from that is since their fingerprints are there, they were there. You didn't see them there, but you can assume that's true because you see their fingerprint. The example people use again and again, and we've used it before, is you're in an office building, there are no windows, you're working one of those terrible jobs in a closet, and as you get ready to leave, everybody who's walking into the building is soaking wet. You don't have to see it raining outside to know that it's raining. That's what's happening, and that's circumstantial evidence. And in this case, trials can be all sorts of things. Trials can be just like one huge piece of evidence. You got the video of the person committing the crime. That's a huge piece of evidence, and you just sort of put that out there and say, look, here's the huge piece of evidence. Do what you will. This case is more like a mosaic. It's all these little pieces of evidence that when you put them together, the prosecution wants you to see a picture. And the picture they want you to see is that Scott Peterson killed his wife. And that's what you have here. So you have to think about this case in total. You got to think about all these little pieces of evidence and whether or not at the end of the day, when you put them all together, you can say that Scott killed his wife or not.
Right. And, Brett, I think you've already said this, but again, a lot of people retort direct evidence is better than circumstantial evidence, and that's just not the case. And in most cases, we just don't have direct evidence. And now in this case, we have kind of a patchwork of circumstantial evidence, and we'll walk through it with you, and you can decide for yourself. If you were sitting in the jury seat, what would you think? Is there enough beyond a reasonable doubt?
I just want to say one thing about that, because I think it's such a good point to make about the whole direct versus circumstantial evidence thing. You guys know we're fans of Maggie Freeling's Unjust and Unsolved podcast. If you listen to her show, the number of cases in which they have direct evidence that the person did it, they have an eyewitness, they have an identification, that later falls apart. It's almost all of her episodes. So, this notion that a circumstantial case is somehow inferior to a direct evidence case, it's just wrong. It is fundamentally wrong. And when you hear a defense attorney, because it's usually defense attorneys, on one of these podcasts or documentaries saying, well, all they had was circumstantial evidence, they're playing you, because they know as well as we do that circumstantial evidence can be very powerful.
And legally just as sufficient.
Absolutely.
And so we started off by talking about the sensationalization of murder trials by the media. Now, this is very interesting because there's another element to this case, and the prosecution harp on this, and that's Scott's aversion to the media. We've talked about how difficult it is to predict how someone is going to act in the most important or most stressful times in their lives. But ordinarily, when someone has a missing family member, they want to be in front of the cameras as much as possible. Take Fred Murray, for example. Fred Murray is Maura Murray's father. He is a very introverted guy, but he was in front of the camera for Maura because he was trying to draw attention to Maura's case, trying to plead for information to get the interest up for her case so that hopefully more resources would flow in or tips would come in that would lead to her discovery. And Scott doesn't do this. This is his wife and child. They go missing, and ordinarily people would expect that he be in front of the cameras, probably distraught, probably crying, begging, Laci, come home, or if you have Laci, let her go. This is my whole life. This is my child. This is my wife. But he doesn't do any of that. Instead, he avoids the media completely. When he walks out of his house, the media are camped in front of his house. He covers his face. He looks down, kind of like you see celebrities do when they're trying to avoid the paparazzi. So what people do is they draw inferences based on nothing. And all they have is him walking to and from his house. And the media starts putting their own narrative. Look how cool and calm and collected he seems. And that's really hard because we'll see this later, but even if Scott talked to the media, they're going to warp it to fit their narrative as well. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of situation. I don't know, Brett. I mean, in this case, I really do think it hurt him from the beginning because he never had the initial sympathy factor. And so the media turned on him on a dime.
Right. And you know, I kind of leave it to you guys out there to decide what you think about this. The fact of the matter is, we have said this a lot of times, and I think it's true, and we're not backtracking on this. It's just really difficult to draw anything from the way people act. As Alice said, there certainly became a point for Scott where it didn't matter what he did. Whatever he did was going to be bad. I do think arguably in those first few days, Scott was not in that position. He still could have been the grieving husband looking for his wife. Now, he never plays that role. I don't know how that cuts. Because you could say, look, that shows he's not guilty, because why would he act that way if he murdered her? If he murdered her, he'd be all crying in front of the cameras or whatever. And I think that's one reason it's really hard. It's really hard to put any value on this or not. But I think Alice is right. This, from the very beginning, the media in particular started to hone in on Scott and say that he was guilty. And they did it as much on feeling as anything else. And you see that if you've seen any of the coverage of this case. I mean, you can see that again and again and again. And maybe the media was right, but we're going to talk about a lot of evidence in this case. And I think if you're going to decide whether or not Scott did this, better to decide based on that evidence than how he acted in front of the media. The other thing that the prosecution put on that we also have talked about and can be problematic is Scott's general demeanor in those first few days. And once again, we're just going to present this to you, how he acted. You can decide how much weight you think it has, and if this is just one of those examples of how people act differently in different circumstances, or if you think this is a situation where you really can read something into Scott's behavior. If you've seen the video of the interview that he has with the police, he is relaxed. There's no question about it. You know, you watch that video, he does not, you would never know this is a man whose 8-month pregnant wife is missing.
Yeah, he's even drinking a cup of coffee.
Yeah, he's just drinking a cup of coffee. For a conversation.
And I've got, again, you know, we've talked a lot about this. Everyone acts differently. But you know, one thing that I try to avoid doing when I'm in a stressful situation in court. So for oral arguments, or if I'm, up at the podium, speaking, trial, whatever it is. If I know I'm going to be nervous, I actually make it a point not to have any cups near me, because if I'm nervous, my voice may not seem nervous, but I know my hands will shake, and water will show the slightest movement. And exactly. Or no, even just the slightest movement, because I don't want anyone to perceive me as nervous. Even if I look calm, I know that any amount of movement will move that water. So I myself actually avoid having cups of water or cups of liquid around me when I have to give speeches or appear in court during a stressful situation. And I just find that interesting, because he's drinking coffee, and from it, you can tell his hands aren't shaking. He's totally relaxed. Now, maybe he needs coffee. I live on coffee, so I can sympathize with that. But that is a very relaxed mood to take. Think about it this way, Brett. If you were going to talk to our boss or someone important, maybe an elected official, someone who's more important than me, right? I don't wear hats. I don't carry drinks or food during it, because I'm trying to be as professional as possible.
This is really important. You know, this is a conversation about your missing wife. It's important for two reasons. Number one, Scott's no fool. He knows if something happened to Laci, he's going to be the first suspect, whether he did anything or not. And number two, he wants to find his wife. Assume he's completely innocent. Even more reason for this to be critical. You know, this is like a pound the table. Why are we in here? Let's go find my wife type situation. Once again, maybe he just reacts differently in different circumstances. The coffee thing's interesting. When you're in court, they give you these little carafes of water and little cups, and you can pour the water from the carafe into the cup. And I never do that for the same reason Alice was talking about, because if I do it, you can see like my hand shaking when I, when I have it, because court's nerve-wracking. And I've got to think this is nerve-wracking, but you do not see that from him. We'll see if we can pull the video and throw it up. So if you're on YouTube, you may be watching this right now, but you just don't see it from him. You know, he's drinking the coffee. He's He's sort of relaxed. He's kind of leaning back, not showing a lot of emotion in this video. He doesn't show a lot of emotion at the press conference. Once again, he could be a stoic guy, but he never breaks down. It never seems as though he cries or upset. He's not grilling the police about what they are doing and whether they have updates. And honestly, if you've watched the documentaries, Laci's non-blood relatives, so like his relatives, his sister-in-law, they seem more upset to this day that Laci was missing than Scott did at the time, for whatever that's worth. And it becomes a thing, and it's a thing that's testified to in court. So that night, you got December 24th. This is the first search when they're first looking for Laci. And I don't know what Sharon was thinking, Laci's mom. I don't know what she was thinking at the time. I don't know if she suspected Scott or not, but she certainly noticed that he wasn't acting how she would expect. She talks about during the search is starting and she first sees him and she goes up to give him a hug and comfort him, and that he kind of moved away from her. He didn't want her to touch him. And she also said that he avoided eye contact with her. Laci's brother talks about how Peterson sort of wandered off by himself and also wouldn't make contact with him. Peterson and Laci's brother had a really good relationship. They were really good friends, but Scott, he never spoke to him that night. It's weird. You know, other family members talked about this, how he wouldn't look at them, even though he had been sort of this boisterous guy who had a connection with these family members. This could go one of two ways. Either it's because he feels guilty, or he didn't have time for that. That's a possibility. He's so focused on finding Laci that he's not going to be doing these sort of things. He's not there for chit chat. He's not there for hugs. He's there to find Laci.
And I will note that, you know, to give him the benefit of the doubt, these things were not brought up by the family immediately, right? At first they were on, you know, we are a united front. Scott had nothing to do with this. Sharon never mentions this. And it isn't until Scott really becomes a suspect, or really I think his continued lack of emotion, that Sharon and Laci's brother Brent then look back on the night that Laci went missing and said, you know what, he was acting weird that night. So I do point out that they didn't say immediately that he wasn't acting in the way that they expected. It wasn't until later on, and it might be hindsight 2020, or it might be shaded by the fact they now think that he is guilty of killing their daughter and sister.
Now, one conversation that I think is a little bit more solid and you can draw something from is a conversation that Scott had with his father-in-law, who was Laci's stepfather, Ron Gransky. Now, interestingly about Ron's a fisherman. Ron likes to fish. He knows about fishing. So even Scott has said that in subsequent years that one of the reasons he bought the boat was because he thought he could get closer to Ron and they could go boating together or something along those lines. In any event, that night, Ron asked Scott if he had gone golfing that day because he knew that had been Scott's plan. And Scott told him, took a pause and said, no, I actually went fishing instead. And he told him what time he left to go fishing and what time he was at the marina. And this surprised Ron. This was something Ron remembered because as a fisherman, he was like, what in the world would you be fishing for at that time of day? For those of you who are fishermen, you know, it's kind of like the best times to fish are early in the morning and late at night, or right as the sun's rising and right as the sun's setting. If you've ever been out on a lake, you can actually see the fish sort of come to the surface at those times of day. And so that's a really good time to fish. But, you know, Peterson's out there in the middle of the day, which, whatever, but it struck Ron as strange. And when he asked him what he was fishing for, Scott just walked away from him and didn't respond.
And Brett, you know, to talk about the time of day, this is where if the best times of day are when it's darker outside, it would also make sense that would be a better time to dump a body. There are fewer people. Maybe it's harder to see out there. It is Christmas Eve, so maybe earlier in the morning, fewer people are out there. I guess it could cut the other way that if that's the best time to fish, there are more boats out on the water. But it would be pretty risky to be dumping a body into the bay in the middle of the day, broad daylight, right?
Yeah, if you think Scott did it, you have to assume that his thought process was, if I take my boat out in the middle of the night or early in the morning, maybe somebody will think, oh, you were definitely dumping a body. But if I go out there in the middle of the day, I can sort of get away with it without anybody. Who would do that, right? Like, there's so many things that happen in this case that I don't know if they cut against Scott being the killer or if they just show how premeditated this was. There are so many moments they're like, who would do that? Who would kill their wife and then leave this message saying like, hey, sweetie, hey, beautiful, do this, do that. Like, who would do that if you just dumped your wife's body in the bay? And the answer is a calculating killer who's really planned this out and wants to make sure he doesn't get caught. So I don't know. I think it is an interesting question. It seems to me to be an incredibly dangerous thing to take a body into the middle of the bay in the middle of the day and dump it. Now, it was Christmas Eve. There wasn't anybody else out on the water, but you're right there. You would think if you're going to dump a body, you wouldn't do it at essentially noon. In addition to that, another interesting thing about this is Peterson tells Ron that he went fishing, and he tells the police that he went fishing. But for reasons that are unclear and are kind of confusing if you think he's some master criminal, he tells Sharon's cousin, Harvey, who was also there looking, that he went golfing that day. And he also told a couple neighbors that he was golfing all day, which is unusual. It's unusual that he would mix that up, right? Like, why would he tell people he went golfing? Why would he tell half the people he went golfing and then the important people that he went fishing? I don't know how significant this is. Honestly, it seems like more of a mix-up to me. I just don't understand what his criminal motive would be for telling some people he went golfing.
It's just a weird mix-up. You don't mix those things up.
That's true, but
especially if you've already told the story. If you've already talked to the police, if you've already told Ron, you wouldn't. It's a story you've told a couple of times. It's not like you have to remember what the story is. Unless he told those people that he went golfing earlier in the day, and then later on when he starts getting interrogated, he's like, I can't be caught in a lie. I need to tell them what I was actually doing. That's a possibility too.
There was another individual who was there that day, a neighbor, Sandy Rickard, who said that Peterson just kind of walked up to her, put up his hands and volunteered, I wouldn't be surprised if they find blood on my truck because I cut my hands all the time. And then he said something about how, I'm an outdoorsman, and that's what happens when you're an outdoorsman. And Sandy remembered this because she found it completely perplexing that he would just walk up to her and volunteer this information.
Right, like, why her? She's not one of the family members. She's not the police. No one said anything about blood. If anything, they would be worried about Laci's blood, not his blood.
Yeah, I wish I had committed a crime or was a more regular liar so I could give you some sort of insight. This is when we need a criminal on the podcast. We need a criminal co-host who can come in and be like, yeah, you do that because you're nervous and that's what happens or something like that, right?
But all to say, it's perplexing. Multiple things he does is perplexing, and that's certainly one of the most perplexing things.
And you got to remember, if he killed her, and this is why this is so hard, because one of two things are going on with him. Either he murdered his wife, or his wife, who he loves, even though he's having an affair, he still loves her, and he still loves his son, his unborn son, is missing, and he's incredibly worried about her. And he's probably also a little concerned the police are going to think he did something to her. And you can sort of think that either one of those are sort of overloading his mind and causing him to do things that appear to be weird and unusual and strange. And maybe that's all there is to it, but it's hard to say which thing is motivating him and which thing is causing him to behave in this unusual manner.
The next thing the prosecution brings up is the boat. the boat that Scott Peterson had recently bought and that he took out on December 24th. The boat was a 14-foot aluminum fishing boat. That's a Class A boat, one of the smallest boats you can buy. And the prior owner had never used it in salt water, only on calm, freshwater lakes. Scott had paid $1,400 for the boat, including the trailer, on December 9th. And although it's not impossible to take this kind of boat out into San Francisco Bay, it would be dangerous for someone who's not an expert because it is so small and can tip relatively easily, which is why the prior owner really only used it in calm lakes.
Yeah, I think the boat's really interesting. And what do you think about the boat and why he was doing that? So the defense is going to use the boat. They're going to attempt to use the boat to their advantage later on. They're going to say the boat is so small and San Francisco Bay is so choppy and so dangerous that he couldn't even dump a body out of the boat without sinking the boat. That's how unstable this boat is. And they do some tests, and we'll talk about those later. But here's the thing. It's a good point. This is a really small boat. It is a cheap, small boat. He's saying he's doing this so he can go fishing with his stepfather. I mean, his stepfather's not his stepfather, with Laci's stepfather. He's not going to want to go out with him on this boat. He's going to be like, just get in my boat. We don't need to take your little crappy boat out into the San Francisco Bay. And we know before Scott even bought this boat, he was searching online for all sorts of things about the San Francisco Bay. He was aware of the tides and the currents and everything else. So to me, it is weird that he would buy this boat if what he really wanted to do, and this is what he claimed. He claimed that what he enjoyed doing was saltwater fishing, and that's why he wasn't going to take it to freshwater. He wasn't going to take it to these freshwater lakes near Modesto. He wanted to go saltwater. Well, why did he buy this boat if he was going to do that? If this boat was actually a boat he was planning on using regularly in places like the San Francisco Bay, this is not the boat for him. He should not have bought this boat in the first place.
And let's talk about what you are supposed to use that boat for, fishing. Scott was, by all accounts, a terrible fisherman. Scott said that he was taking the boat out to do some sturgeon fishing. Now, the prosecution called an expert fisherman to testify about that type of fishing, and the expert stated that Scott's rod was not rigged for sturgeon fishing. It was rigged for freshwater bass, and the line weight was wrong, the rod was wrong. In fact, one of Scott's rods didn't even have a handle on it, and therefore it wasn't functional, and another rod had no line on it. Really quick, Brett, what an interesting thing, because I know we throw the word expert out there, but truly, you can call an expert for anything. I've never had a fisherman expert before. All you really have to do is show that they have an expertise in whatever they are testifying about, and there probably is a fight about whether that person is in fact an expert and should be allowed to testify. But you can see how it's really helpful to have an expert who knows what they're talking about here, because I can't look at a fishing pole. I could probably notice that there's no line in it, but I wouldn't know how it was rigged for purposes of, saltwater fishing or freshwater fishing. And this is all very helpful because he gets it all wrong, is what we hear from the expert.
And this expert's great, by the way. This is actually, if you're going to read some of the testimony, his testimony is way more interesting than most of the testimony in this case, because it actually was kind of interesting to hear from this expert fisherman talk about all this stuff.
Right. And, he goes further. The expert reviewed Scott's tackle box, and he testified that it was filled with equipment to fish for freshwater bass. Moreover, the anchor would not work in the bay. It was just too small, and it wouldn't be able to dig into the ground, and there was no long rope in the boat for the anchor. So if your anchor can't dig into the ground and it can't even reach the ground, there's really no use for that anchor, right?
And you remember Scott said that he was trolling that day. So, he's like, well, I was just sort of threw the line out back and kind of motored around the bay. And essentially he would have to do that because he didn't have a functioning anchor.
And finally, the prosecution raised this. There's the question of why Scott would go all the way out to the San Francisco Bay. The prosecution put on evidence of at least a dozen places much closer to his home in Modesto where he could have fished. That would be more suitable for his boat and purposes than the San Francisco Bay. By the way, I think that's a really effective strategy for the prosecution to do this, to show you have a boat that's fit for a certain type of water. Here are 12 different places that you can go instead of the San Francisco Bay. Why did you go out of your way to go where your boat is not fit for and you didn't have the equipment for? As a juror, I think I would be very interested in this piece of information. This information cuts the other way too, right? The freshwater around Modesto was likely more secluded and perhaps a better place to dump a body. San Francisco Bay was the closest saltwater fishery to Scott, though if Scott preferred saltwater fishing, one wonders why he had freshwater tackle.
You know, one of the reasons I like this case, and although I do not recommend spending the rest of your life attempting to read the transcripts, it is worth looking at some of this because you have a really good defense attorney and you really see the ebb and flow of a good trial, because the prosecution, they call this expert witness, this fisherman. He gets on the stand. He tells all this great stuff. They talk about the fact that there are all these other lakes nearby. And then the defense attorney gets up and basically says, well, yeah, but aren't they more secluded than the San Francisco Bay? Wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't it be less likely for people to see you if you went out to the freshwater lakes as opposed to going out to San Francisco Bay? And it's a good point, right? I mean, it's like, yeah, that's a good point. That would be better. You have to wonder, though, and if you're the prosecution, I don't know if they ever made this point, but it's a point to make. If you were going to dump a body, dumping it in the San Francisco Bay has number one, it's bigger. Number two, it's possible that the body will just be washed out to sea. There are more animals in the bay that might eat the body. So there are reasons to prefer the bay, but it was a good job by the defense pointing out this other possibility.
Right. And what you said is so apt for the situation. You said the ebb and flow of trial. You're right. It is so much more fun to have opposing counsel who are good counsel because you do want that ebb and flow. Because even if the defense doesn't point it out, there is probably a juror who's thinking it, and you want that ebb and flow to come out so that you can respond to it as the prosecution, as the defense. You want them to basically lobby it up so that you can then give your answer as to why that's not true, right? So Brett just did that right there. So sure, it's more secluded, but it's also closer to their home, more suspect. Why would those are probably the first places that would be searched because they're close to the home, whereas the San Francisco Bay is farther away.
And you also have to wonder if Scott did this, it's possible he made sort of a decision that day. It's possible that initially he did not plan on telling the police that he went to San Francisco Bay and that's where he was. It's possible that he did not intend to do that, but maybe people saw him there, or he made a decision at some point. They'll never find the body. It's better just to say I was out there, because then nobody can question that. Nobody can say we saw Scott Peterson down at the bay, right? And so I don't know exactly how that came about and how him admitting that came about. But if initially he intended to stick to some story about he was playing golf, then it makes even more sense to go all the way to San Francisco to dump the body, because like you said, it's farther away from you. It's farther from home. It's easier to explain, maybe, if the body turns up than if it turns up in the secluded lake where you're the only person who was there. So a couple interesting things that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to go ahead and shut down for today. And this one is really important. And it's something I want you to think about both through the rest of this podcast and whenever you're watching or listening to people talk about this case. And it's the clothing that Laci was wearing that day on the 24th. Scott told the police that Laci was wearing a white blouse and black pants, which is what she was wearing on the 23rd. But when her body was found, she was wearing tan pants. Now, what's interesting about that is most of the stories that you hear from people, one thing we're going to talk about at some point is all the sightings of Laci and how people always say, how could Scott have killed Laci when she's sighted in all these different places after he supposedly killed her? And in almost all those stories, the people who claim to have seen her say that she was wearing a white blouse and black pants. It fits with what Scott says, but it doesn't fit with what Laci was wearing when her body was found. And you have to wonder, if Laci wasn't wearing those clothes that day, then what's the story? What does that say about those sightings? How did she change clothes? Was she wearing those clothes and then suddenly the burglars or whoever kidnapped her allowed her to change clothes into her tan pants? But here's another interesting thing. The black pants and blouse were found in Laci's home, hanging up. And in fact, the defense used this fact as an argument that she wasn't murdered on the 23rd because those were the clothes she was wearing then. And if she had been murdered then, she would have been wearing those clothes when her body was found. So you can't have it both ways. Either she was wearing the clothes or she wasn't. And if she wasn't wearing those clothes, then all of those sightings that you've heard about suddenly become much more suspect.
Yeah, I don't know what to do with that fact, Brett, except that she was wearing those clothes on the 23rd. But according to Scott, they did quite a few things once they got home, right? They ate pizza, they watched a football game, and they watched a movie. And if she's wearing a blouse, it's probably not lounge clothes. And even not pregnant, the first thing I do when I get home is change into lounge clothes.
And we know what she was wearing because Scott told us. He was wearing her blue sweatpants.
That's right.
Or his blue sweatpants. So there you go.
So I don't know what that says, except that, yes, she was wearing those clothes on the 23rd, and she probably took it off as soon as she got home, as many people do, right? Not just pregnant people. When they get home, they change out of their work clothes for the day and get into something more comfortable. I'm sitting in more comfortable clothes right now after wearing more formal clothes to work today.
Right. And I don't know, and we don't know, and we'll never know when she was killed, if she was killed on the 23rd or 24th. And we don't know why she was wearing tan pants, whether she had put them on the morning of the 24th or she had put them on after taking these clothes off and hanging them up on the 23rd. But one thing I think we can say for sure is she wasn't wearing those clothes when she disappeared. She wasn't wearing those clothes when whatever happened to her. And so she probably wasn't wearing them walking the dog that morning. The last thing that's kind of interesting, I don't know how much it means, but in the closet, in the spare bedroom, the door was open and there were some duffel bags that appeared to have been pulled off the shelf, and one was lying upside down on the floor. Now look, you come over to my house, you're going to see stuff all over the place. And if I got killed, maybe you would draw all sort of conclusions from that. But one thing that this makes you wonder, it's possible, if you're trying to figure out what happened here and what led to this murder, if Scott did it, and let's say it wasn't planned, it could have been one of those things that was spontaneous. It could have been one of those things where maybe that morning, we know that assumed that Laci was on the computer looking at sunflower umbrellas. And maybe the person who logged into Scott's email right after that search wasn't Scott. Maybe it was Laci. And imagine that she sees something in that email. This kind of reminds you of the Michael Peterson case, the other Peterson, right? One of the theories is that Kathleen Peterson logs into his email, sees the emails between him and people he's having an affair with, and snaps, and that leads to the murder. The same thing could have happened here. And you could imagine a circumstance in which Laci starts pulling down these duffel bags. She's saying, I'm going to leave you. She's going to pack her clothes and leave, and Scott snaps. And maybe he does something. And all of a sudden, now Laci's dead, and he's got to deal with it. That is something you could imagine happening. Also possible that the spare bedroom door was just open and the duffel bags were on the floor. And this doesn't mean anything. But it was something when I was reading through the transcript and reading through the police officers describing the home and how they found it, it was something that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good theory, Brett, as to what may have happened if she was alive the morning of the 24th. This is the last thing we'll cover before shutting down for the day, and we'll have you back next week for more of the story. But we'll leave you with Scott's alibi as presented at trial. See, during an interview with the police, Scott says that he abandoned his initial plans for the day to play golf because it was too cold. Instead, Scott says he decided to go fishing. We've already discussed this. This is just absurd. We've said that the cold doesn't stop people from playing golf who like to play golf, right? People who play golf are just really committed to the sport. They will play no matter what. And
they're crazy people. I mean, I love you golfers, but you're crazy. You're insane.
And number two, if it's too cold to play golf, how cold do you think it's going to be on a boat in San Francisco Harbor? It's going to be colder out there. It's going to be windier. And one of the employees at the harbor testified that hardly anyone came down to the marina that day because of how cold it was. Scott was just one of 3 people there that day, and the employee called it a gray, drizzly, nasty day.
And I think this is significant, the fact there were only 3 people there, because some people are going to say, well, it was Christmas Eve. How many people would be out on Christmas Eve? I mean, I just got to tell you, that's prime time for a lot of people to go out because they're off work and they can get away. Go down to the golf course on any holiday and it's packed, right? So the reason there are only 3 people out on the water that day is because it's a terrible day to go out on the water. Only people who love fishing and are insane or have a body to dump, you would think, would go out on the water that day, particularly, and I know we're harping on this and we've already hammered this a little bit, but it's worth hammering. Scott has said he didn't go play golf because it was too cold. So it's not like he's some manly man who the cold doesn't matter to him and he's going to go fish because that's what you do. He's hardy and he's going to go fishing. No, it was too cold to play golf. And he wants you to believe that it wasn't too cold for him to be one of 3 people to use that marina that day to go out on the water.
Right. Well, moreover, Scott leaves all day, 1.5 hours away from home when his wife is 8 months pregnant with their first child. This is completely inconsistent with anything I can imagine anyone doing. I mean, it really is. I mean, go ahead, Brett. You can talk to that. You've been in this situation before with an 8-month pregnant wife, and with your first child, the jitters that come with that of not knowing when she's going to go into labor or just wanting to be protective, wanting to be close by in case she needs help with the mopping bucket.
Right. And look, Laci was having a tough pregnancy. It wasn't, terrible. She wasn't in the hospital or anything, but she was having issues where she was having difficulty walking. She was having some problems with dizziness and just issues that somebody who they're having their first baby, they're 8 months along. These are the kind of problems that people have. So it wasn't as if she was out running marathons while she was waiting to have this baby. She was starting to have problems. Scott even says at some point, there's this question about they went to Disney World, I guess, or Disneyland, I should say. And she was in a situation where she actually had to be pushed around in a wheelchair because she could not walk that much. It was just too much for her. She couldn't do it. And Scott, in Scott's defense, when this comes out in trial, tries to say, oh, well, that was just Scott being nice because Scott recognized how difficult a time she was having. And so he did that as a courtesy to her so he could take care of her. Well, he's taking care of her at Disneyland and then he's leaving her 2 months later for an entire day to go an hour and a half away to go fishing while she's 8.5 months pregnant or 8 months pregnant. It's just one of these things does not compute. Either Scott's this considerate husband who was really worried about her and the problem she was having, or he's not. And like we said last time, maybe he's just a jerk, but him being a jerk, it has to do so much work in this case. And it makes you wonder if maybe in reality, the reason he was fine driving an hour and a half away is because there wasn't anybody waiting at home and there wasn't anybody that he was worried about. He was only worried about covering up the thing that he had done. So that brings us to Amber Fry. And Amber Fry probably deserves an entire episode, but she certainly deserves more time than we could dedicate to her today. So we're going to go ahead and stop for now. We will be back with you next week, and we'll talk more about this case, and we'll talk about Amber Fry, and we'll talk about the things that Scott was doing while his wife is missing. And we'll talk about some of the other stuff in this case, including some of the more concrete pieces of evidence that may point to Scott's guilt. And then we'll give you an overview of what the defense said when it was their turn, when they had an opportunity to put on a case, and talk about whether or not the evidence that they presented is compelling as well. Well, Alice, it's been a pleasure, as always, to talk with you about this case. Do you have anything else you want to add before we call it a day?
No, I hope you guys are enjoying this ride and, putting yourself in the seat of the juror. And obviously, this is what happens in trial too. The prosecution gets to go first. There's cross-examination, but the prosecution is really the one to put the story out there first. So if you're swayed so far by the prosecution, that's normal. But don't forget, there's another side of the story. So make sure to come back for that.
Yeah, you can't make any decisions yet because the defense still has its time. If you guys have thoughts or comments you want to make, feel free to email us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com. We're at prosecutorspod and all your various social media networks. We're on Patreon. We're on YouTube. So check us out there as well. I do want to give a shout out. A lot of you guys have been noticing the fantastic art we have for each one of our episodes. That is all courtesy of Hannah Hill, who has been doing art for us and is really just amazing. If you guys have not checked out all of the different things she's done for us, we post a lot of this stuff on Instagram, so you can check it out there. Her Instagram page is at Serious Moonlight. Look her up. She's got some great stuff, and we are so happy to have her doing art for these episodes. Well, I think that's all we have for today. We will be back next time with more on the Scott Peterson case. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
Other to be ready, and when you were like, we were waiting for each other, all I could think of was my favorite comedian. Do you know Mike Birbiglia?
No.
He has this show that is actually on Netflix, I think, called The New One. And he's talking about going to yoga and how deferential everyone is. And so, like, people really want to put their mats certain places. And he's like, we just all become deferential whales. Like, no, you go. No, you go. No, you go. And I felt like that's what we were doing. Like, maybe Brett's busy. Maybe Alice is busy. We'll just see when someone is ready to record.
Call you today? What are you going to call you? Do you have any words that you want to be called?
Just Alice. Fat Al. Big Al. That's what my brothers used to call me.
Big Al.
Big Al.
Roll Tide.
Nice.